Well, I've got two things going on. I'm doing a group coaching with Brandon Cook. That's going to start April 17th. And then I've also started a group with another friend called Human Solidarity Group, where we are coming together. It's basically a group where we are acknowledging things like racism, sexism, any way that our fellow human being or ourselves have been othered, and coming together to honor our human journey so that we can come for the healing and wholeness of ourselves, each other, our ancestors, and our future generations. And that's just a group that we are doing on Thursday nights, and any and all are welcome. And then I am starting a coaching group with my friend and someone that I consider an informal mentor, Brandon Cook. He is the podcast author of Naming the Real, and we're going to do a 10-week online coaching course on Zoom, and it's exploring the pathways toward a flourishing life. It's unique in that it's a hybrid of educational resources as well as coaching, where people will get individualized coaching in a group context. So community, you and I are talking about community for whatever challenges they are facing as they seek to live as fully human and engage their own flourishing. That's starting April 17th, and we are getting a registration page up very soon. Welcome to Grief Heals, the podcast that explores how grief heals. Join us as we consider how grief invites love within ourselves, our communities, our world, our histories, and how it is that grief heals. I'm Lisa Michelle Zega here with Eric Simpson.
Did you finish the book by Jim Forrest?
Oh yeah, I finished it a while back,
Oh,
and then I went back and read new parts of it. I read more parts of it. I just his life is so it's intriguing, it's beautiful, and it I'll tell you one of the things that I took from the book, or I'm going to even say like absorbed through the book, is this trust that, like, he calls the book Writing Straight with Crooked Lines, and I want to say that was from a Portuguese proverb that said that God writes straight with crooked lines. And one of the things that Jim said is, in writing this book, he wrote it really for his grandkids, and, so that they would remember their grandpa when he was gone. But as he wrote it, there was a softening for him, like a level of self-compassion. What I absorbed through it, though, is the beautiful mystery of how life works out, of how, we don't know where we're going. And it's not about quote unquote getting it all right or doing it all right. And his life is just, I feel a lot of energy in my belly. It's just beautiful, Eric. His life it's hopeful, it's good, and it doesn't mean that he didn't have things that he questioned or wondered about, or maybe wishes he could have done some things differently. And his time of imprisonment where he's away from his son, or just different aspects with his children and stuff like that. And yet, even when him and Nancy at the end, they are self-supporting and they're supporting themselves through their art and their work. And he talks about nights being up all night, wondering how it was all going to work out, and tearful, prayerful nights, and then getting the benefit of reading it after he's left, and recognizing, oh, okay, Lise, it all works out. God really is writing straight with your crooked little lines. And I have found myself comforting myself really through his story.
what's interesting about that is my take on it. The thing that goes off in my brain, which I don't think, knowing Jim Forrest, would go off in his brain. So it may seem weird for me to talk about it in this context, but I think I shared with you that Deleuze and Guattari, their talk about hierarchy and the rhizomatic structures that they see life existence more like as a rhizome, which are like horizontally growing life or plants, um, where it's all about different connections and a variety of different connections that coexist rather than a hierarchical structure that places power at the top and then trickles down. And so what made me think of that is that idea of a straight line. In a rhizomatic type of scenario, there are no straight lines, but I suppose whatever path you take would end up looking straight to you.
Yeah, the mystery there. I think I originally heard this from Rob Bell, and I don't know the original source to give credit, but I remember him saying there are no straight lines in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And that just stuck with me and comforted me and has like opened my eyes in nature. And I think there's something that is being communicated in that proverb about writing straight. But even as you were talking, I was picturing Jim's life like as a rhizome. Am I saying that word right?
Mm-hmm.
and and even thinking about him on this bus, like, or where was he? He's at a bus stop and he sees Dorothy Day's memoir, something loneliness, a long night of loneliness,
The long
something like that.
loneliness.
The long loneliness. And he grabs that and he's reading it on a bus, and it ends up changing the trajectory of his life. I think he might be on the way to boot camp. I don't want to
Oh,
miss.
wait, he just found that book on a bus?
He found that book at a shop as he's getting on a bus,
Oh, okay, okay.
and he devours the book. The title just stood out to him. He didn't know the person, he
Right.
didn't know the context. I was just at the Friends of the Library, and I went there for one specific book. I had seen it there. It was like brand new. I was going to get it for a girlfriend. And the lady's like, "Oh no, you're spending as much on this as you could on an entire bag of books." And it was a special that day. So I go, and I had no more business filling a book bag, especially with my addiction to books. But I did it, Eric. And I bought this book called Shadow Catchers that is, when I'm reading it, I'm like trembling. It's like I know this book is significant in my life story. It was the title that stood out to me. And now I'm reading it, and it's about Native American healers. And it is
Mm.
so beautiful. And I'm learning more about God through this book. And like it's reshaping my life. Anyway, it just reminds me of the rhizome that you mentioned, and this idea of it's all sprouting in different directions, and it's all this interconnectedness, like a root system or something. And when I think about how much of my life it just has felt like happenstance, and yet I see this culmination and coming together, but not like a pinnacle, right? Like it still is continuing in this way.
Mhm.
Well, Jim's book is like that for me. Jim's book has had a profound impact on me and met me like it's almost like I wasn't ready for it yet.
Mm.
And then when I was, you introduced him to me, and yeah, it's just perfect.
So I have not read the book yet.
Yeah, but you've known the man.
Well, I knew
You've
it.
known the
Well,
man for more than 30 years.
well, from a distance, yeah, I've known him.
Yeah,
Uh,
well,
He, um, he, and I've read his emails and stuff. I still want to read the book, so I need to get it, I think, and read it because I don't know. He didn't sit down and tell me his whole past.
it's a beautiful book. It's
Right.
it's really, there's a quote that I want to read. There are so many, but this one had an impact on me. And he says, I'm looking to think of the context, but I think it'll be fine without the context. So he says, it opened the door to realizing that peacemaking begins with seeing what is really going on around us, seeing ourselves in relation to the world we are part of, seeing our lives in the light of the kingdom of God, seeing those who suffer, and seeing the image of God not only in friends, but in enemies, seeing how interconnected we are. What we see and what we fail to see defines who we are and how we live our lives. The day to day challenge is to be aware of the divine presence in the other, struggling not to be blinded by fear.
Yeah.
I just, there's something that you said in one of our podcast episodes where you said, well, I think love is attention. And
Mhm.
you didn't limit love to just being giving attention, but that just, oh my goodness, it's like I just soaked that in and it felt like my spirit like just metabolized it. And then I read that quote from Jim and it's like, yes, this seeing. Oh, well, we're not talking about her today, but Bell Hooks, that one of the things she says about love is how important it is to see ourselves,
Mhm.
to see our own thoughts, to see our own actions in this quest to love, to be loved, to receive love, how important seeing is. And when I even think about why it would matter that our own grief be witnessed, it's a way of seeing so that we can not just see ourselves, see others, see our communities, so that we can, to go back to Jim, like that's how peacemaking begins, is with the
Mhm.
act of seeing. Anyway, I concur from my own experience when I couldn't see myself, I couldn't see the other, and I my love was, well, it was spotty. He talks about Thich Nhat Hanh in different contexts when he first meets him, and then when Thich Nhat Hanh asks him to travel. They called him Thai, I think.
Mhm.
When Thai asks him to travel with him, and then maybe Thai means teacher, maybe that's why. And then later, when he travels, I want to say to France, and then ends up staying with him again for an extended period of time, I think he meets one of his wives when he's overseas. Now, this wasn't in the book. It was, I remember his editor, who was a lifelong friend, a guy that
Mhm.
he met when I want to say Jim was 19, and the man that became the editor of 10 or 12 of his books, he was 16 when they met.
Mhm.
Anyway,
And he's a
they
son of
did
a
an
famous political figure.
Okay. So he asks him about loneliness in an interview with him. And it was really beautiful because in that interview, he says, well, he basically is talking about his wife, Nancy, and how deep and intimate and beautiful and loving their relationship is. And he said loneliness, it just didn't even feel present. Like you could hear in him, wow, this isn't resonating in my lived experience right now. And then he talks about how much loneliness he had in fact experienced, but he said because he had had failed marriages, he just didn't know. He didn't know if he could have the kind of marriage that he and Nancy later enjoyed. And that was, it was beautiful, it was hopeful, it was just so touching hearing him talk about their love. And you can, in the book, in Writing Straight with Crooked Lines, you can hear his celebration of Nancy and his adoration of her, his respect for her. It just comes out very fluid. Yeah,
Is
it's
this
really pretty.
this was an just for the sake of clarity, this was an interview with Robert Ellsberg, is that correct?
I,
From Orbis Books.
yes.
Okay.
Okay, so here on page 179 of his book, he says one of the precepts of a rule of inner being that Nhat Hanh had written called on his students not to avoid suffering or close your eyes before suffering. Do not lose awareness of the existence of suffering in the life of the world. Find ways to be with those who are suffering, including personal contact, visits, images, and sounds. By such means, awaken yourself and others to the reality of suffering in the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so at one point, Jim's talking in the book, and he said that the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, there was division going on, and they were coming together. There was a lot to be discussed, and the tensions were really high, the stakes were high. And Thich Nhat Hanh told him that it would be helpful if each member carried a green plant. And I think they ended up carrying marigolds. But he said, look, plants are very sensitive to the emotions of others. They don't thrive in environments where there is tension or glaring. And so he suggested that each member of I4 be responsible to care for a plant. And in the end, they were able to have a meeting and shape the new direction of I4. And Jim felt like the caring for the plants had a profound impact on the way that the meeting went. And that really stood out to me that, like, oh, yeah, plants are not going to survive in an environment where there's aggression toward one another.
That'd be an interesting thing to witness, to be in an organization and have one of the members of the organization say that everyone has to take care of a plant.
He
Mm.
said, while a member from Switzerland played a violin, we each took a flowering marigold in our hands, felt its soil, placed it in a pot, and took responsibility for the growth of our own and each other's plants in the days ahead. And then at the end, he said the drafting of statements and setting of program priorities was necessary work, but more important was the sense that a fresh wind was blowing into I4 sails. The council participants left smiling and excited.
Mm.
That was the end result. Like,
Well, that's good.
just beautiful. He said that Dorothy Day often described the Catholic worker as a school. He said that it was a school for him. And he says, among the things I learned in that year of my life is that the poverty stricken, the homeless, the jobless, the afflicted and abused, the addicted and mentally ill, the unfortunate, the people for whom houses of hospitality exist, were at times easier to live with, more patient and compassionate than those who had come to serve them.
That's a pretty strong wording.
When I started in recovery, I didn't recognize that that was going to be setting the stage to open me up and to hold me close when my world fell apart. Like, so when I started recovery, I did not know that my marriage would be ending, a year and a half later. It really supported me in being honest with myself, being honest with the harm that I had inflicted. It was a supportive environment. It was like a lifeline. And then somehow the recovery room didn't help me necessarily to fully enter my own grief. And I don't know that that was the recovery room or just where I was at in my process. My grief was directed out there to what I had done and where I needed to make amends. It wasn't so much directed at what had been done to me and where love needed to come into my own wounds. I had that sentiment of, isn't this what church is supposed to be like? Somebody, and this is interesting talking about recovery rooms. I was with two people who had both spent many years of their life in addiction. I think it was heroin addiction. One of them posed the question to the three of us and said, at what season of your life were you the least free? And both of them, in some kind of way, referenced their life and their addiction. And I said, oh, all my years in church when I thought I knew the answer. I was the most in bondage when I thought I knew the truth.
Mhm.
That was fascinating to me.
Oh, and that's interesting because, I'm talking about Jim Forrest and the quote that you gave and, our experiences in these types of things, that he remained committed to his religious growth. And, I know that he was Roman Catholic and then he went on a trip to Russia. Does he write about that?
He does. He does. And he even talks about Dorothy Day being the precursor, like when he was a young man and taking him to his first Orthodox service and
Oh,
like that he didn't, that he recognized all those years later. And also Dorothy Day, I believe, is the one that got him reading Russian authors.
yeah.
So well before his experience in Orthodoxy in his latter years. Yeah.
Yeah, and Dorothy Day she was very traditional Roman Catholic, but she didn't get along necessarily with her bishops, with some of the hierarchs in the Catholic Church because of the political ramifications of her spiritual teachings. So,
Yeah, it's so that's another fascinating thing about Jim is recognizing how he was continually wrestling with his faith, with his convictions, with living from that place and willing to follow at great cost at times. And he writes about the falling out with Dorothy Day. He writes about the reconciliation with Dorothy Day. Like, it is just so utterly human.
so with Dorothy Day, she turned him on to like the Russian, like Dostoevsky and people like that.
Hmm.
And then I remember him saying that he liked the black churches too.
Yes, and yes, he did. And he references that in the book. And I believe that it was Jim who talked about the richness of spirituality in the black churches. And I believe that he made reference to the suffering that people were in touch with that evoked such an aliveness in the churches. He talked about how different they were than the Eastern Orthodox Church, I want to say he's referencing, and that they each held a richness of their own that was
Mhm.
compelling for him.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because we set up this whole thing where we're saying people who are in recovery tend to approach things more honestly. I mean, that's basically what we're saying. And Jim said that some of the people that came for help were more compassionate than the people that were there to help them. It just made me think of Jim Forrest's involvement in these activities, as well as all of the people that influence him, because even Thich Nhat Hanh says that the next Buddha will be the Sangha or the community rather than an individual. And that's a very important thing. And I'm just wondering how we wrestle with, because being involved in something that restricts you in such a way that you can't be who you are is not liberating. And that's been my experience in some churches. And, I'm not going to blame external elements for my own choices and my own responsibilities. So I can see how it can be freeing or liberating to leave a context that is harmful to you and that enslaves you and enslaves even the way that you see and perceive things. I'm just wondering where then that community comes in. Because even though I haven't attended church in a long time, I still think that the community aspect is important. I'm curious about his chapter on Henry Newland because we don't hear that much about him usually. Because I know that he was a intellectual. I watched a documentary about him probably 15 years ago. He was very popular in the academic circles and especially among students, and had a lot of potential and wrote books, and then ended up spending a lot of his time caring for people who were with developmental disabilities.
Henry Nouwen befriended him after he got out of prison and checked on him weekly. He also invited him over during Easter and he sent him away for a week-long retreat at a Trappist monastery in upstate New York. When he ended up at the Eastern Orthodox Church, Jim said that among the most distressed by my change of address was Henri Nouwen, and he sent a letter full of anguish. Jim publishes his letter and how he was responding. He doesn't publish
Okay.
Nowen's letter to him, but
Yeah.
how he responded to him. And he says, "You expressed the hope that we would be bridge builders. I share that hope. I have brought with me everything that was dear to me in Catholicism. On Easter night, I was moved that one of the hymns we sang was a traditional Latin Easter chant." And then he says, no hymnal was needed to sing it. And then he reminds him of a passage from Merton. He does talk about Dorothy Day became a second mother
Mm.
and that her life was characterized, if he could only give one word, it would be hospitality. There's a section where he talks about his mentors. So he calls Dorothy Day a second mother. He calls Thomas Merton a second father. He says, "Thank God for Henri Nouwen. The hardest events of my adult life have been my three failures in marriage. Henri helped me get through a time when I could see no light at the end of the tunnel. His wedding gift to Nancy and me was a reproduction of St. Andrei Rublev's icon of the Old Testament Holy Trinity. In explaining that gift to us, he helped me see icons with more understanding and appreciation." That was his tribute to him. Eric, I know you didn't read the book, but I think it's really relevant to just maybe say how Jim has impacted you,
Oh, yeah.
you know?
Jim Forrest had a pretty significant impact on me just because he took me seriously as a human being and gave me respect and engaged with me as an equal. When I would share with him some of the things that was going on in my life, he would be compassionate. And when I told him, I can't remember what the situation was. I just remember his response. The situation had something to do with the deception or something. And he just like wrote and said, I've always had difficulty with lying. And he was just open about his own proclivities to sin because he's like every all of us. And that taught me to be open and honest about myself. And I didn't immediately start being open and honest, but over a long period of time, I started to see how honesty really is the best way to go.
To giving and receiving love. And yet, that is a harrowing journey because to be honest with ourselves also means to be honest with our trauma, our grief, our
Right.
wounds, and we're not often given tools for that. So I thank God for people like Jim who are able to enter the suffering of others, the confessions of others with compassion.
Mhm. One of the major things from Jim Forrest, because I came into the Orthodox Church and had been Orthodox for a few years. And like him, I was impressed with the beauty of it and with the genuine vitality of it because it's not when you go into a service, it's high liturgy, but let's turn to our hymnals to this thing. And on the other hand, it's not all just an emotional experience where you're just singing songs off of a overhead projector or something, and there's not a band, so so there's that aspect of the worship. And then the first time I went to a monastery, but I'm not talking about the first time I went to an actual parish in Santa Rosa, California. And the priest, Father Michael Margotich, said, "This is Jesus." And I was just blown away because I felt for the first time the presence of Jesus in the church, and I mean the actual real presence of Jesus in the church. I'd already made up my mind to become Orthodox by then, but I had my girlfriend with me and she was impressed as well. And she also became Orthodox. I came into it in that kind of context, but then as the years went by and I wanted to be myself and use my gifts, whatever gifts I might have, there was a lot of negation. There was a lot of, I wanted to publish a book of St. John of Damascus wrote a book on an exposition of the Orthodox faith. And I wanted to just simplify the language, kind of like I used to do for Calvinist works. Simplify the language, make it easier to read, just take out the these and thous, not change anything else in it. And I wanted to do like one of those GoFundMe's it wasn't called GoFundMe, it was something else, in order to raise money to do this. And I sent out emails to like all the priests in the United States and all the Orthodox people I knew. And I got so much negative feedback. How dare you want to change St. John of Damascus? Nobody's reading St. John of Damascus in the Orthodox Church right now, unless you're like going to college or something. So they didn't want it, so I didn't give it. I found this to be repeated over and over again in my experience in Orthodox Church. Just sit down and say your prayers, and there are people in that context who say things like, you shouldn't even say the Jesus prayer until you've been Orthodox for 20 years or some ridiculous thing like that. There's just this rigidity that's set in to Orthodoxy, this rigidity and this stiffness of like the stiffness of a corpse. And sooner or later, I just got tired of it. I want to be able to express myself. I want to be who I am as an Orthodox Christian. And Jim Forrest accepted me in that way. He let me edit in communion. He accepted the writing that I sent to him and published it. He encouraged me when I wrote my book on the Beatitudes. And when I wrote to him, he responded to me, and he always said things that were helpful and loving and kind. And actually, a few times he actually did send me money as well when I needed money, when I was in a very difficult place. So, I mean, I guess I just said Jim was a friend. He was a true friend and an Orthodox Christian who impacted me to treat others in the way that he treated me. And so that's what I go for. So a lot of times I fail and I'm not at the same level of grace or experience as he is, but in that way, he's my mentor and somebody that I want to be like. And I've met other people, by the way, since then, since I met Jim, who have the same characteristics. So he's not alone in that. And I don't want to paint a picture of the Orthodox Church as this terrible place where everybody's mean, and Jim Forrest's the only one that's not. That's not what it's like. That's not what it's like at all.
I love you, and I am so thankful for who Jim was in your life. And I'm thankful that you brought Jim into my life.
You've been listening to Grief Heals with Lisa Michelle Zega. The podcast is produced by me, Eric Simpson, in association with Jump Up and Down Productions. Music by Kendalian, Drunken Nights to Sunday Mornings, and Stefan Carlin, A Calming Ocean, A Common Notion. If you would like more information about the work Lisa does, point your browsers to legityou.com. That's LEGITYOU. Lisa can also be reached at lisamichelle@legityou.com. This has been a Jump Up and Down production.